Hello, Matt. Good to meet you. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
So let's get to know you then, Matt. You're quite a familiar face around yearly meeting in Britain because you've been an elder with us recently. Um, but I understand you're not a, if you might call it a British friend, you're an American friend. So maybe you could start by putting that into context for us. Can you just tell us kind of how come you've been in Britain so much, and is that an ongoing thing, or what's the situation first of all? So we
Yeah,
understand.
I grew up in the US, but came over to study to Britain, and so got involved in my local meeting here in Oxford, and then in Britain yearly meeting.
Yeah, great. Okay. So so we start these interviews then with your journey into Quakers. So I wonder if you can tell us about, what were you seeking when you became a Quaker? What did you find? Why have you stayed?
Yeah, sure. I joined with friends after a difficult adolescence. I, as a teenager, was very depressed and anxious, and Um, I struggled to have a sense of what I was supposed to do and how to live up to what I felt I was supposed to do. The people around me were uh, very much dedicating their lives to making the world better than they found it, and I struggled with finding the strength inwardly to live in that kind of a way. Um, at a really low point as a teenager, I started to have these experiences of a loving and caring presence in my life, uh, and a voice in the heart which told me to listen and follow, and I'd be all right. Um, and so I came to friends. I had a sense that though friends might not fully understand the experiences I was having, at least they'd listen, and help me to find the resources to understand what was going on in me. And very early on in my time among friends, I was given George Fox's journal to read. Um, and I discovered in that book a young man like myself who'd been depressed and had wandered around the country looking for answers, and found that the answers on offer about how to live, about finding the strength and power to live in the way he thought he should live, were not helpful. Um, he was told to smoke tobacco and sing psalms, and he'd feel better, which he says tobacco is a thing I didn't love, and psalms I was not in a state to sing. Um, and he got all these answers about things out there, which were like bits of clothing he could put on, but didn't change him inside. Um, and this went on until he saw that he needed to turn inward, and found one, even Christ Jesus, inwardly, who could speak to his condition, and his heart leapt for joy. Uh, and this was so much like the experience that I'd been having, that I found in Fox a kind of a strange fellow traveler. Um, and this helped me to understand what was happening in meeting for worship and in Quaker community in ways that were not obvious to me at first. These were things I really didn't understand. Uh, but I stuck around finding the help to listen to this inward guide, which I'd been looking for.
Right. So you started off by saying that you couldn't live up to those kind of role models that you were seeing around you who were doing amazing things. So who were you growing up around to be witnessing? Like what was that, a church community that you were involved in that you saw great things happen, or was that charitable or political issues?
Um, yeah, both in faith community and yeah, I was both my parents are doctors who've dedicated their lives to helping people in pretty difficult situations. Um, I was aware really early on in life that war was fundamentally wrong, that um, violence between states didn't make any sense, um, but really struggled with this understanding and what it might mean in my everyday life. And the idea that if I was sort of beat up on the playground, I ought to not, I ought to accept it in some way. I just couldn't find um, the strength to live in that way. Um, yeah, and when I looked around me, these people who were caring for each other, devoting their lives in this way, and this was not what I found when I looked within. Um,
So, I mean, you're still very young, so you can remember these trials of childhood, if you like. I wonder when you just said about, when we're beaten up in the playground, which is, it's happened to many people, and you ought not to respond with violence, I suppose, is what you mean. Can you tell me a bit more about that? What was your thinking about that, and how you struggled with that?
yeah, it felt clear to me that responding with violence would simply add violence to violence and perpetuate it. But this felt like a kind of a rule or a program. It didn't change me inside. I was still angry or frustrated or hurt on the inside. I just now had this sense that there was something I ought to be doing or not doing. Um, and what I found among friends with our peace testimony was an understanding of a power that changes us on the inside.
Mm.
First of all, we're able to live lives of peace because we know a power which uproots the seeds of war in us. And despite knowing that I shouldn't take out my feelings on other people, I nevertheless felt the seeds of war in me, anger and frustration and so
Mm.
on.
So, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying that you knew the rule first. You knew the peace testimony, if you like, or you knew this call to be loving rather than violent. And you tried to follow it, or you could follow it, but it felt an empty thing to follow.
Yeah, and a difficult thing to follow. I mean, really difficult, um, in my personal life as well as in the world.
Mm, mm. I I just think it's so important that we learn these lessons at an individual level before we can start to think about geopolitics or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the things I love that William Penn says about early friends is that they were changed themselves before they went out to change others. Um, I think that's one of the things I needed to learn, that I needed to be changed myself before I could offer the peace testimony as a kind of answer to anyone else.
Yeah. I really want to come back to that idea of needing to be changed ourselves. Let's hear a bit more, if you don't mind telling us more about these experiences that you had then. What
Sure.
can you tell us about those?
Yeah, sure. Um, Initially, these were experiences of a kind of a caring and loving presence, like I said, a kind of warmth, and a feeling of being watched after, I suppose. Um, and as I started to pay more attention to these, they started to happen more often, and I started to have experiences of this inward voice, um, which gave guidance. Um, yeah. Over time, as I read early friends and experienced more and read the Gospels, I came to recognize this as Christ's voice in the heart, as early friends had recognized. But that was a slow process for me.
Mm.
I felt I knew the teacher before I knew who the teacher was.
And how old were you when you had these?
I must have been sort of 15, 16.
Wow. So many of the people I've spoken to have said that teenage is a real spiritual time of awakening, really. So tell me about how you found Quakers then, the Religious Society of Friends. You were presumably at home somewhere in the States and you were looking around. Did you look at different types of churches? And what happened there?
No, I didn't. I knew about Friends from a very early age. My mom had gone to Haverford, at Quaker University, and had gone to meetings for worship and so on. So I knew about Friends as this option. I knew a bit about the Quaker tradition, not very much, but I'd grown up in a kind of secular Jewish family. Um, and Judaism had at one time helped me and spoken to me, but um, I couldn't see much in it that would help me understand this experience. Um, so Friends seemed like an obvious option. I knew just enough to know that there might be something there.
Tell me about your first time at meeting then and your first few years or so. What was that like?
Um, I I didn't understand meeting for worship at all for a long time. I sort of maybe understood what was happening in the quiet between messages, um, though this was not talked about at all. But there was some kind of maybe contemplation or meditation or prayer, some kind of listening. And then every so often somebody would stand up and give often a moving message. Um, these sometimes seem to me like friends sharing their really great ideas, and I didn't have any particularly great ideas to share. Um, so I really struggled to understand how this listening and then these messages went together. Um, I knew that something important was happening, and clearly it was related to what these friends then went and did out in the world, how they lived. But there was just very little talk of this. There was a lot of talk about what friends did out in the world, but very little about how they found the power to go and do that.
Yeah. Which is one of the biggest things I want to talk about these in these interviews, really. So can you just was that a liberal tradition then within the States? Because obviously in the US you have three different types of Quakers, whereas in the
Please, yeah.
Britain we don't really. How,
Yes, I
how
started
did you
attending.
decide where to go and what were the differences that you noticed?
It was just where I was living at the time. There was a Liberal meeting, and I wasn't. I'd had these experiences, but at the time, I still wasn't so sure about this Jesus character or this Christian tradition. Especially growing up in a secular Jewish family, it felt like that was a bit of a reach.
Hmm.
So Liberal Friends seemed a good starting point, and I was in some ways it was good because unprogrammed worship was so strange. I could kind of figure out what to do with a program, but in an unprogrammed worship, I had to listen, had to allow the strangeness to work on me.
Hmm. Yeah. So in terms of an unprogrammed liberal tradition, then you experienced that in the States for a few years before you came to Britain for the first time. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about the differences that you observed and what you make of that. So your
Yeah,
first impressions.
sure. Um, Uh, there's not a great deal of difference in my experience. I I think I've sometimes felt that friends in Britain are uh, because so many friends in Britain have come from other church traditions, often Anglican traditions. Um, there's a real often a real and understandable woundedness in response to Christian language. Um, and I think perhaps even more so than among American liberal friends. There's a real desire to be welcoming and inclusive, which is wonderful. but even less of a shared language um, among liberal British friends. In a sense that a shared language might be threatening or exclusive. So it becomes very hard to talk about, for example, what's going on in meeting for worship for us. Um, Outwardly, it looks very similar. Um, yeah.
So do you think the same thing? You said there's not much differences. Do you think the same fundamental things are happening in meeting for worship in Britain as in the liberal tradition in the States?
Yes. There's probably more Bible reading and some prayer and hymn singing in American liberal meetings. But more or less, I think it's quite similar.
Because it seems to me that all that, though that's a small difference, that's actually quite a chasm. It feels like a chasm, you know, that there's a little bit more Bible reading, a few more hymns being sung. It's like that's
Hmm.
a few minutes of huge difference.
Yeah, well, one big difference is that um, liberal friends in the US can't think that they're the only or the main Quakers. There are these other traditions. Uh,
Mm.
they're evangelical and programmed and conservative and holiness friends. And um, so there's a sense of the liberal tradition being one understanding of the wider religious society of friends. And I think friends in Britain sometimes have the sense that this is real Quakerism, and those things are not something we need to take too seriously.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? Not take it too seriously.
Yeah, we can understand the program tradition as this thing which started in America and was spread by Americans and is a kind of carries some elements of Quakerism forward, um, but that British friends have preserved the real essence of Quakerism. When in fact Britain Yearly Meeting, then London Yearly Meeting, has been through an extraordinary number of different phases and has changed a great deal. I think there's sometimes this sense that Quakerism began when we sat down in meeting for worship for the first time. Um, we don't have to deal with the fact that friends have been meeting for worship for a very long time, and that we are inheritors of a tradition that started well before we were around.
Mm. And in American liberal traditions, is there a sense of being inclusive with the language, just in case there's someone who I don't know, is coming from a different tradition or is Buddhist or something like that within the meeting? There seems to me to be a nervousness to be really inclusive and not mention God, not mention Jesus, not even read from the Bible too much, just in case there's somebody here who is not with us on that. Do you get that same sense?
Yes, more or less. At its best, I think there's a wonderful practice of allowing everybody to speak authentically in the language they'd use for their experience, and everyone else working to hear the life behind the words. Uh, and then often instead, there's a real fear of stepping on eggshells and excluding by saying what we are. At the worst, there's a desire to be absolutely whatever a newcomer would like us to be. Um,
And of course, there's this term now of radical welcome. And it feels to me it's a lovely phrase. I mean, it's a wonderful phrase. I'd love to be radically welcome. And you know, I try to be. But it seems to me that the way in which the term radical welcome is being used is, as you've just said, what do you want us to be? He's quite desperate, you know. What do you want
yeah,
us to be? We'll change to accommodate you.
yeah. I mean, the roots of the word radical are rootedness, and I hope what it means is welcoming people into into this tradition, into this experience. And, of course, we should welcome anybody who finds meaning and value in our meetings for worship. But that welcome doesn't mean you can make Quakerism whatever you'd like it to be.
Has that already happened though in Britain? I mean, you've come at this with a fresh pair of eyes. I've been around for 20 years now, and I've only just started really speaking out like this. Um, so you've come, well, relatively young, which you still are, and relatively new, and come from a different, similar tradition. So you've got a great insight. Have we already lost a real connection with the tradition of what Quaker worship is?
um, in some ways, we're in the process of losing much of our understanding, and in particular losing the resources that would allow us to have a conversation about our experience in worship, our experience as friends. What Bill Tabor called the language for the inward landscape. Our tradition has this extraordinary language, much of it drawn from scripture, for giving voice to what the guide is doing in us and among us. And with a loss of that language can go a loss of experience. And that's a problem. I think the result can be a real impoverishment
Mm.
of our meetings for worship.
So let's use some of that language then, if you don't mind, for a few minutes. Would you be able to, as difficult as it is, it's near impossible, but can you try to use some of that language to explain and describe what happens for you in a really great meeting for worship, where you really feel connected spiritually?
Yeah, sure. Um, in some ways, I think one of the most important things to say is about the role of Jesus, of Christ in this. For a very long time for Friends, uh, Jesus's outward work, his life and death and atonement on the cross and resurrection, belong together with what Friends understood as Christ's inward work in the heart. Um, we could know Jesus teaching and guiding and raising up the good in us and holding down the evil in ourselves, and could know that this was the same teacher, the same guide who had lived and died and risen again. Um, and at various points in our history, uh, Friends have privileged one or the other of these things. The outward life, death, and resurrection, those Friends have tended to become programmed and take on kind of the trappings of Protestant Christianity, or the inward work, divorced from the inward worker, and these Friends have tended to become very liberal, and it feels really important to me that I think one of the great insights of early Friends was that these two things belong together. That we can understand what's happening in us by understanding this much longer story, and we can understand this much longer story by hearing it in the spirit that gave it forth, by looking at what's happening in us. So for me, meeting for worship is centered on the presence of Christ, who is present among us where two or three gather in his name. He's present among us in what Friends have called all his offices, as a guide and a teacher, as a comforter, as a gatherer. And I experience different of these offices as the teacher teaches. So some meetings for worship, I've experienced guidance, leading. Sometimes this is quite small, a leading to speak in meeting or to speak to a friend at another time. Sometimes it's a sense that there's something bigger with my life I need to be doing. when I first felt a leading to travel in the ministry among friends, it was in a meeting for worship. Um, at other times, I have a sense of this presence gathering us together and knitting us to each other. Um, Sometimes I have a sense of the presence covering the meeting, and holding us together. Um, Very often, what somebody has said in meeting for worship has answered exactly what I was holding in prayer, and been something I really needed to hear. Um, but um, but what's really essential for me in the meeting for worship is Christ's teaching each heart in the words in the presence that heart needs. Uh, there's one real minister in a Quaker meeting, Christ, and our job is to be as attentive as possible to that minister.
How much of that happens in meetings for worship in Britain? Um, I mean, among friends, no one else is listening, Matt. Um,
Yeah,
it's tricky, isn't it? Because I do really want to know your thoughts on that because I think, yeah, I don't have the language to explain what I think is going wrong. I think there are some things that are going wrong, or going wrong's perhaps word, but just off track, just un maybe unguided is the word, it's kind of gone off the rails, if you like, and it's still moving, but it's not particularly on the rails. I don't know how better to describe it than that.
yes. I think a lot of this is still happening in meetings, but it's happening um, sort of undercover. And Yes, I think the starting point for me of a Quaker meeting is a clear perception of our own needy condition, our need for help from Christ's transforming power. Um, and if we come in a position of thinking we can do it in our own power, we can produce a gathered meeting for ourselves, um, we're not going to have that experience of a guiding and gathering presence. True waiting worship happens when we set aside our own ideas and agendas. Um, and I feel that understanding of coming from a place of need has sometimes gotten lost. Um,
Mm. And of course, mostly when Quakers speak to people, we don't give this kind of guidance. And I think, I suppose chaplaincy provides people come to you and ask you a question. So in places where there's not Quakers, I find myself saying things like start on your knees, in your cell. Just take some time to get on your knees and recognize, I mean, as you've just said, your neediness. And I don't know if you've heard the interview with Harvey Gilman where we talk about, please, thank you, help, wow. It's just, and I use that now. And because it's so simple and easy to remember. But we're so unused to having these conversations within Quaker spaces. We get on to talking about Gaza or the climate or all sorts of other things so quickly. And I think it's yeah, it pains me. I think is the best I can describe. I mean, worrying me is what I usually say, but it doesn't worry me in the sense, it just pains me.
yeah. I just don't know how to have those conversations without um, a clear shared frame of reference, a shared language, and a sense of the absolute centrality of the gospel. I mean, if it's not the case that Christ has come to teach his people himself,
Mm.
as the early friends proclaimed, then I have no idea what we're doing together.
No,
um,
no, no
and no
me.
idea what a meeting for worship is about.
And I also want to say that I believe that, the a Buddhist who might be joining us is perfectly aware of that. Is perfectly aware that that is the kind of meeting that they have joined, and they may never want to see it in quite those terms, but they enjoy the fellowship with us. And they really don't mind us talking about Christ having come to teach us himself. That's why they've come, almost.
And we've always recognized, and it's certainly true in my experience, that people are perfectly capable of experiencing that life and power without recognizing it as the life and power of Christ. Um, people people experience this presence and power long before they're ready to recognize it as Jesus, as I did.
Mm.
Um, uh, it's important. I think friends have thought that we do come to recognize it because we'll much better understand what's happening in us if we do. But the experience itself is open to absolutely everyone. Um, and I think people can recognize that when they come to a meeting for worship. They find themselves warmed by the fire.
Can we touch on a little bit then? Can you say anything about having come from a Jewish background and perhaps dealing with community or family who are surprised, maybe shocked, maybe disappointed, I don't know. And how did you navigate that?
Yeah. It's been all right, really. I think partly because, in some ways, my secular background is more difficult than my Jewish background. Um, the very fact of being religious at all can be the challenge. Um, One of the blessings of my Jewish upbringing is that I feel I have at least some familiarity and comfort with the Old Testament, with the scriptures, and and that's a real gift. Um, but yeah, in some ways, simply coming to faith was uh,
Yeah.
the challenge, and can I've sometimes thought this even among British friends that in some ways my faith, the language I'd used to express it, makes me unintelligible. Um, I have to do a lot of translating in order to really get my experience across as best I can. Um, and that's difficult. It's especially difficult when you feel you have to do that in your own faith community.
I know, I know. And I remember many years ago, I'd only been around for maybe 5 years in Quakers, and I was talking to them about, I don't know if you might call it spiritual development, and I was feeling very much in need, and I wanted people to speak with about that, and they really couldn't help me. And I was really trying to say to them, well, where do I go then? Like, if it's not you as my spiritual community that can help me with these questions, it's a very confusing place to be. And I really do feel like British Quakers have just got a little bit lost. That one of the things that I'm worried about is let's talk about eldership for a minute, because I know you were appointed a yearly meeting elder, and I've seen you in operation, if you like. Um, so I've been very grateful for your ministry in that way. Um, I hope that British friends regain a confidence of where we see leadership, eldership, spiritual authority, spiritual guidance, and whether that resides, we don't have pastors, so whether that resides in elders or in other forms of ministry. Um, I think sometimes we simply fill positions because there are people willing to do it, which is, we've got to be grateful for, because, there's a lovely passage in Quaker Faith and Practice of, we take what we can get, and, thank you for serving, friend. So I think there is a value in that. But nonetheless, how do we recognize spiritual gifts and find the right people?
I have the sense that the fear of spiritual authority uh, is the result of secularization, in the sense that if we're really going to all be equal before God, then we all have to have the exact same gifts. Um, and recognizing gifts in order to hold people accountable to them is seen to be a problem. Um, and this is quite different from my understanding that gifts are given to an individual for the good of the community. They're not necessarily given forever. They're given as the community has need of them for its work. They're given by God. They're not ours, and it's our responsibility to help each other to exercise and deepen in them. And when we don't live up to that responsibility, our communities can't as easily do the work that God yearns for them to do.
Mm.
Eldership is one of these gifts, and I'm not sure that recognizing the gift of eldership and helping friends to deepen in it has all that much to do with the role that we call eldership, which is often
Mm.
shaking hands at the end of meeting for worship and these kinds of things.
Mm.
Um, the gift of eldership is about sometimes the metaphor that's used is midwifery, being a midwife of the spirit, and helping friends to see the divine hand in their lives, to see God's work in themselves, and to be faithful to it. Um, Especially those friends who are called to ministry in meetings for worship, who, in traditional understanding, should be accountable to the elders. Um, so elders have a real responsibility for, a gift for discerning the spiritual conditions of friends and meetings. Uh, and that's a gift we deeply need. We need friends with um, a keen sensitivity to that and a willingness to remind us when we're not
Mm.
faithful. I've really needed elders in my life who've helped me in all kinds of ways, often through pointing me back to ways in which I wasn't being faithful.
And what do you make of this move I see, which is towards what we call corporate eldership, which is let's not name anyone because we will all just do it. I feel like that's actually a positive step in the interim because it means that rather than just taking, somebody who's willing to do some of the roles and follow the rules and say, oh, I have to do this, this, this now. I don't think that's always very helpful. I kind of I'm at the stage of thinking, well, moving towards corporate eldership means that whoever is needed to do something will do it. And if they answer that call, and I wonder if it's a positive step for us right now in 2025, letting go of the rule-bound eldership model we've been using.
Yeah, in some ways, I think it's positive. I think my worry is that eldership is not a gift we all have, certainly not a gift we all have all the time. And that's thank God for that. We need many gifts in our community. In the 1920s, London Yearly Meeting laid down the recorded ministry, recognizing gifts of ministry, and holding ministers accountable to them. Uh, and the thought was that everybody would take more part in the ministry if we laid down naming anybody as particularly gifted in ministry. I think the result, and I think friends saw this in the next decade or two, was that fewer and fewer people felt called to ministry, and the growth in that gift that had been seen before became rare because friends were not held accountable to it. That's my worry with the corporatization of eldership, that it might similarly lead to fewer and fewer people feeling um, called to the gift of eldership.
Yes, and you see, one of my responses to that in my meeting that I'm talking about that is one of the things I say to reassure people. It's like, we won't still be sat here on Monday morning, We will have people who stand up and thank everyone for coming or saying it's nice to thank you for this, nice to see you all, and whatever needs to be said in the afterwards and the notices and it'll all happen. it'll just happen more spontaneously in a way that, um, but you're absolutely right. There's more to eldership than just shaking hands at the end of meeting.
And we need to learn that, you know. I mean, while eldership and ministry, these are spiritual gifts, we also deepen in them when our communities help us to do that. And that takes time, it takes accompaniment. Uh, and without that, I worry that, I mean, there's no way I could live up to what God wants from me in any moment without the help of a faith community.
Oh, well, indeed. And even in some ways a flawed and inadequate faith community is good enough. Um and I still, am compelled to go to meeting every Sunday, even though I have these issues that I feel compelled to raise. Um Let me ask you a bit about age then and eldership. You may have heard me say this before to other people. I do really value eldership in the sense of old people. I really value old people, older than me and very old, people who've lived a long time, literally in their 80s and their 90s. I just love the composure, if you like, and the priorities in life are right. And there's something deep there to teach us. And I was speaking to a friend from Kenya who said, well, pretty much over 75, most friends are elders. And I thought, yeah, there's different ways of doing this. I'm guessing from what you've said already, that's not quite how you see it. And you've been appointed elder, of course. So what do you make?
Yeah, I think there's something right about it. I mean, when friends first began to be named as elders, it was because they were, as those friends would have said, weighty in Zion. They'd had a long experience of time among friends and were mature and ready to help people. Um, I think that's very valuable. I think the gift has to start somewhere. And it's really important for younger people with a gift to spend time with older people with that same gift who have spent time growing in it. That kind of accompaniment feels essential to me. And I've been very blessed to know some older, really gifted elders. Um, yeah, I mean, should somebody my age be appointed to Elder Britain Yearly Meeting? I don't know. I don't know. But I think the understanding of eldership has changed so much in the yearly meeting, has become so much of a role that needs filling.
Absolutely.
That's
And
part.
yeah, it's really interesting, Matt, because normally I would say no. Normally I would say, I think you're in your 20s, are you? I mean, you're young. And yet I have seen you act decisively and compellingly in meeting where you stood up and asked somebody to stop interrupting and to sit down. And I felt that was it was quite a powerful and transformative experience. And I thought to myself, would any other elder, not as young and not as from another tradition, if you like, I've done that. And it made me think, well, actually, that was so remarkably unusual for us that it was a powerful lesson that, the thousand of us sat there watching really noticed, I think. And you used your presence, you stood up and you said very clearly a word. I think it was stop, I can't remember, but it was about boundaries. It was about this is what we expect. And I feel that we've lost that clarity of purpose, really. So although I would have been a doubter, I don't really feel that eldership is perhaps best given to 20-year-olds, right? If I'm honest. But you did a wonderful job. So I'm really grateful about that. But it also says something to me that why am I so disappointed in the lack of clarity amongst elders?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, my experience is definitely that the Lord will work with whatever we give him. And if that's 20-year-olds, uh, they'll do the job that is needed. Um, so I think, I think that's true. His strength is perfected in our weakness. And
Mm,
I felt that way very much at the yearly meeting. It felt like an absolutely crazy task. And knowing that, and knowing my need for help was really important. I mean, if I'd felt comfortable in it, I would have really worried. Um, so I think allowing myself to be helped and led is what was needed.
yeah. It's really interesting, this idea of being uncomfortable. And of course, I've had lots of these conversations. It really is apparent to me that this whole notion of quaking and this whole notion of ministry, it's powerfully uncomfortable and discomforting and in some ways awful. And you think, what am I doing? Why am I putting myself through this? And I've described it somewhere as, well, I'm willing to put myself through it and go through it because it's very hard to say no to. I don't want to say no to it. It feels very disrespectful. Um, but
Yeah.
it's very, very uncomfortable.
Yes. I mean, when I first felt this leading to travel in the ministry, I resisted for a very long time. I thought I was much too shy and introverted to go traveling. The last thing I wanted to do is be speaking and meeting. I mean, it's really not. I find it terrifying.
Mm.
And I've had some experiences which have made it clear that I need to be faithful. I was once in a meeting for worship, and quite quite near the end of the meeting, I felt I really needed to stand and speak, and I had some sense of the message and that it would be uncomfortable to say and probably to hear. Um, and I thought maybe I could just kind of let the clock run out. But this sense that I wasn't being faithful got stronger and stronger. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw this friend who, quite a weighty friend in the meeting, and somebody I knew would really not like this message, um, and would let me know that. Um, and I thought, okay, good. I don't need to say it. And I heard this voice which said very clearly, "Who are you going to follow? Who are you going to listen to? Me or this friend? This fear of what other people will think." And then I knew I had to get on my feet. So I'm learning slowly to listen, uh, but it's still very difficult for me.
Yeah. And maybe it will never be easier. I mean, do you get a sense of, I'll tell you, my sense is that we can be used even though we are flawed. I mean, if you see what I mean. I mean, clearly I'm
Yeah,
flawed. People criticize me all over the place for all sorts of really good reasons. And where I'm not particularly good at stuff, it's pretty obvious to everyone. And yet, I feel there's some benefit to some of the things that I do and say. And I just think, well, I have to do it. What's your sense of that?
yeah, I think that's true. We have to allow ourselves to be used and allow ourselves to be pretty detached from the consequences of that
Mm.
use. Um, One of the great gifts of traveling in the ministry is that you keep traveling. You don't stay around in one place.
That's my
So,
mistake. Yeah.
whatever the consequences are, I don't typically get to know, which means, yeah, if it goes really well, it doesn't go to my head.
Yeah.
And if it goes really poorly, that's fine. I'm not, I think that's a real gift.
Yeah, I talk a lot about. I don't know if you know, but at Wimbledon, apparently, inside, just as the players go out, they have that saying of, triumph and disaster, meet those two imposters just the same. And triumph and disaster is something that is on my mind continuously, as you say. It's like, especially when doing something as public as this, oh, great, what a wonderful interview. Oh, disaster, what a terrible interview. It's just like, and you just kind of gotta go roll with it, really.
Yeah, we're called to be faithful. We have to do uh, what we're asked to do. The point is obedience to the guide, not success.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me a bit about the traveling ministry then, because as you say, in Britain we're just not familiar with this really. I mean, we talk about it, but and we have visitors from other yearly meetings like yourself, but I don't think anybody really knows what it's all about. So
Yeah.
what is it? And what is it and what should we be doing? We should probably be doing more of it in Britain for sure. So
Yes.
what is it?
Um, well, I mean, in some ways, it's the oldest Quaker practice. It predates the settling of meetings.
Yeah.
Uh, I guess simply traveling in the ministry is feeling led to go and worship with friends, sometimes to bring a message, but I think often, I mean, certainly for me, having no idea what the message might be, but um, feeling led to be there. Um, and and with my meetings help and discernment, doing that, traveling to worship and learn together from Christ, our teacher, um, and wherever one is led. And part of the difficulty of this for us modern friends is that it for me, I often don't know what the message is. I don't have any plan. Um, Friends want to advertise a talk. I can't tell you what I'm going to say. I have no idea. Uh, I hope I'll have something to say. There's quite a lot of pressure. And there's in some of the old Quaker journals, there are stories about traveling ministers visiting 10 or 15 meetings before being given any message. There's quite a lot of pressure, I imagine, for those friends. But yeah, I just try to trust that I'll be led in each place, given the words in that hour that I need. Um, and have found that that's true, that I've not traveled alone. Um, but that's more or less the practice. And for a long time, it was the circulatory system of the Society of Friends across the Atlantic, especially. Um, and I think we feel the lack of that
Mm, we definitely do. And I think the practice, wasn't it, that it would be a younger minister with an elder?
often. Yeah, and I've usually traveled with somebody serving in a kind of eldership role, to help me be faithful,
Yeah, yeah.
which is
And tell you
really,
when to relax as well.
yeah, and tell me when to shut up, and all of that. It's really needed. When I started traveling, I I think because what I'd seen and learned from just being in meeting for worship, I had this sense that I needed to stand and speak whatever I was given as quickly as possible, and then sit down as soon as I could, because the last thing I wanted was to be on my feet. It was really scary. Um, and I needed an elder who was traveling with me to say, you can wait on your feet, wait as long as you need in prayer, um, and do that until you feel your heart's really cleared. You don't need to sit down as soon as humanly possible. That was a huge help to me, to learn that I could wait on my feet. And I wouldn't have learned that had I not been traveling with this companion.
So tell us a bit about what you did do then while you were traveling in Britain.
Yeah, I guess in the past 2 years or so, I visited about 40 meetings. Um, and often that has meant staying with local friends, going to their meeting for worship on a first day morning, and sometimes, often, some kind of longer session in the afternoon where I can give, if there is one, a longer message, because there's quite a time limit on messages and meetings these days. Um, So a longer session to share and have discussion or worship sharing.
That's great. You used the word first day there. So tell us about your choices with language here around the old months and days.
Yes. Yes, I felt led to the plain speech around months and days. And I think partly that's just about being obedient. You know, I felt led to it, so uh, I feel I ought to use it. I think it's also, though, I mean, the early Friends' understanding was that not using the pagan names for days and months was about not giving unnecessary power and weight to the names of uh, these gods. So, for example, in not using the word March for third month because this is the deity of war, and um, we don't need to name our month after the deity of war. And I feel the force of that. It doesn't feel like a very big deal to me, but it's a helpful reminder to me uh, about what's important in my life, which is being obedient to this leader and to his leadings.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I don't see any of that kind of strange behavior amongst Quakers in Britain at the moment.
Yeah,
There's,
well, it's partly I felt more recently I've come into membership in Ohio Yearly Meeting, which is a conservative yearly meeting, um, where some of these older ways are the practice, and have learned a lot from that about why having this language shared as a community is important.
so you now worship with conservative.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I felt, I think partly because I felt so unintelligible in a liberal meeting and felt such a need for a community with the shared experience of Christ and a shared language about that in order to be faithful where God has put me, and just in order to keep my head above the water. Um,
Mm.
so for me, that's been Ohio conservative friends who've really helped and supported me.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. I bet. And it feels like such a chasm, doesn't it, really, between what you're I mean, I imagine and you're finding a lot of support there now and a lot of real development because they're starting where you're starting and you're moving forward from there rather than you having to keep going back to zero, if you like. And um
I once heard a friend say, yes, in this is another friend who moved from a liberal meeting to a conservative meeting, and he said, with liberal friends, I often want them to be more like my understanding, to to be more of what I'm looking for in a meeting. With conservative friends, I want to be more like them,
Mm.
and that's been my experience with conservative friends. I've felt I have so much to learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Such a There's that line in Quaker Faith and Practice about meeting being a school of Christ, and I feel so much like I'm in primary school, um, and yeah, I feel really helped to grow and very nurtured in this
Well,
community.
if you feel like you're in primary school, it feels to me like some of our Quaker meetings in Britain, they're not even in school, they're not even in the classroom. They're what we call mitching off or bunking off school. That's terrible. I mean, I feel very disrespectful. But it's yeah.
I think part of it is that there's a real unmet hunger. I mean, in pretty much every meeting I have visited in Britain, there have been a number of friends who are really seeking and very often go to some other church before or after meeting for worship
Yeah,
because they feel that there's some part of themselves which is not being spoken to
yeah.
by meeting. Um, and many of these friends are looking for other worshiping communities. So it really feels to me like there's an unmet hunger, and the hunger's there, which is wonderful. Um,
Too. Me too. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's wonderful that it's there because that's the starting point. Um, there's two things that I'd like to pick up on. One is about kind of what we can do about this and what centrally we are doing about this, because I don't think it's enough. But before I get to that, I wanted to think about young friends because you've been amongst young friends. I mean, naturally, anyone your age is going to, to bond with you, I would think. So you have presumably been amongst younger friends here in Britain, and you got to know them, and you've got to hear their concerns. Can you give us an idea of what the situation is amongst that younger generation within their Quaker journey?
yeah, and the group I have known best is the group of young adult friends here in Oxford. And that was quite a small group when I moved to Oxford in 2020, and has grown a great deal in the past few years. On some weeks there have been 30 of us at meeting for worship. Um, and I think there's a real difference between that group and um, some other British Quaker meetings. Part of that is that many of the young adult friends are not coming from other faith or church traditions. Um, they're often refugees from secularism looking for a deeper experience, language, and understanding of what it might mean to lead a purposeful life, which is different from the secular understanding of accomplishment. Um, and they're often finding that in uh, older Quaker and Christian language and experience. So that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And it's not that young adult friends, in my experience, all believe the same things or think the same things. There are Christians and non-theists among us, but there's a real gentleness and willingness to learn from each other, which I think has helped me to feel that I can express myself more fully
Mm.
and be understood and nourished more fully.
So I'm thinking then about what we can do about this centrally. I mean, we have yearly meeting coming up in a month or two, and one of my I don't know, I don't even know what to say. One of my the pressures on me, if you like, my bewilderment, like that, is that there's so much of what we talk about at the early meetings, so much of what we write about, it just feels like it's not actually awaiting and
Mm.
listening to Christ the inward teacher. It's a plan about what political action we need to take and what we think is the right thing. And you can it is quite negative to say these things, but I mean it gets called virtue signaling, and I think that's true. There's an emptiness to that. There's a certain element on victimhood, which I think is not very helpful and very weak. And I just I lament about it really. And I
Yeah,
suppose part of me is thinking, well, I mean, I'm 53, I'm kind of in the middle. I don't know, I don't know, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to call for.
yeah,
What's your impression?
yeah. It's really difficult, and made really difficult by this extremely long and complicated agenda with all kinds of things that require a lot of thought and a lot of consideration, which need to be packed in for all kinds of reasons into a few days. Um, and there's very little time for waiting, and a real sense of urgency about a lot of these things, which doesn't help. Yeah, our business meetings are fundamentally prayer meetings. We are praying our way forward and seeking God's will. And I don't feel very able to do that under time pressure. And certainly not when worship is sort of waiting worship is pushed toward the edges. Um,
Yeah.
I think the challenge is that this is a real systemic problem. Yeah, I think most of the people involved in making yearly meeting happen share the sense of this being really challenging, and there's a lot of pressure on everybody involved. Um, so I'm not sure um, how to bring things toward prayer. Uh, but I think it is really telling that earlier friends in their yearly meetings had about equal time for waiting worship and for business. Um, Often they'd have 3 or so days of waiting worship and then 3 or so days of considering business. And that meant that yearly meetings were really refreshing. You know, friends didn't want to leave at the end of their yearly meetings. Um, and I've often felt that if I tried to go to everything on offer on the yearly meeting agenda, I'd be exhausted for weeks.
Yeah, and people say that, and I mean, we organize a conference for prison chaplains once a year, and I'm always thinking, and we're going to do it this year again. We're going to just have a retreat experience. Yes, we'll cover some training and we'll cover some talks, but actually, we need it to be a retreat into a more of a prayerful way of being for a few days. And I just hope that, what would yearly meeting be like if it was more of that, more worshipful, more prayerful, and less busy.
Yeah. What would it be like if there was almost no agenda and we just let whatever the spirit had in mind rise?
I know. And I do feel bad for the agenda committee because there's people who were sat around with pressure upon them thinking, we have to do stuff, we have to do stuff, and it's all on me. um, and as far as I can remember, one of the earliest things in the agenda, one of the earliest items is to agree the agenda.
Often,
And
yeah.
I must admit, it occurred to me a few weeks ago, that's what I should do. I should stand up and say, well, no, I don't feel that this agenda, I mean, I haven't seen it yet, so I don't know. Oh gosh, I mean, this is what I mean, it's just awful. It's just awful what you feel called to do sometimes.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, wonderfully, I've definitely felt the Lord working in Britain Yearly Meeting, um, even amidst all the busyness and the stress and the urgency. There is a lot of life. It's often around the edges of the meeting, but there's a lot of life.
yeah,
Um, I just yearn for more space to wait and see what that teacher has in mind for us instead of feeling it's our job to construct an agenda and we expect God to fit into our agenda, which
yeah,
is, I'm sure, not how anybody involved thinks of what they're doing. Um, uh, but the feeling is sometimes that the meeting is being led by an agenda rather than by the Holy Spirit.
yeah, yeah. And despite all I've said, I love yearly meeting and I go every year, and it's a wonderful experience, and I would encourage everyone to go. Even if you only just joined us, I encourage everyone to go. It's wonderful. Let's move to then the future of British Quakers. What are your thoughts and hopes?
Um, my hope, my prayer is that by rediscovering the simplicity and the power of the gospel message that early friends discovered, um, the simplicity and power of Christ among us to teach us, we will be able to let go of a lot of the structures and pressures which constrain us and which are I've sometimes used this metaphor of when the Israelites were wandering through the desert, they were told not to store up yesterday's manna, to live each day on the manna that was given to them. And I sometimes feel that we are living off old manna, uh, structures that friends were really led toward at a time, but which are no longer serving the purpose of listening together to the divine voice. Uh, but discerning the difference between what is really crucial and what we can change requires a real deep sense of the foundation. And my understanding of the foundation is that it's this gospel message that Christ has come to teach his people himself. And if we can experience that and understand that, we'll know what needs changing and what doesn't. And we'll be able to speak to the conditions of all sorts of people because Christ is able to speak uh, to us and does speak to us in whatever condition. This is such a life-giving message that the world is so in need of. Um, but we need to be able to articulate it.
Mm. And I think it's not we need God's help and we also need the help of our friends. And it makes me think, what about the ways in which your meetings over there can help us? I so feel that we need, I mean, I spoke to a friend from Kenya. I feel we need Kenyan friends, we need American friends. We we really need help here. We're struggling. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, I feel that one of the treasures that conservative friends have conserved um, is a real waiting worship, uh, an experience of coming together without our ideas or plans and trusting that God will be present to guide us, to teach us, to construct any plans that need constructing. Um, but this real deep sense of waiting, um, which draws us together.
Mm.
I, um, and we really feel when that waiting isn't present in meetings because they're no longer refreshing and life giving in the way that this waiting is. Um, so I hope that's one thing we can um, hold up this waiting worship.
Well, that's great, Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for all of that and all the best for your ongoing ministry and traveling.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.